Hello.
Hello.
Oh, no.
Hello. This is a very exciting,
Goodbye.
happy, positive episode
Yep.
with lots of love and hugs from Bill Clinton. And today, what is this? Episode 85.
Yeah.
Thank you. Of Cookie Pocket.
We're going to hit
I think that's just our
100 this
title.
season. Wow.
We are going to hit 100. It's going to be pretty fun when we happen to hit 100. How's everybody today?
Oh, can't complain.
Pretty good. I got a gig lined up tomorrow, so finally getting
Wow.
work. You guys are going to hear updates on my freelancing throughout this season. I hope you know that.
Zach is being successful currently. We should do like a whiteboard of like with
the most
thermometer,
successful
you know?
member.
Yeah.
Oh, geez.
Profit's not looking too good today, Zach. Step it up. Today we're doing Black Hawk Down, which is a war film. That's it. That's the only genre. This is the first time, I think, ever I've had a movie that only had one genre. It is a war movie through and through, directed and produced by Ridley, sci-fi guy Scott, and co-produced by Jerry Leans-Wright Bruckheimer. And he also did Pirates, I think.
Yeah.
And then composition by drama queen Hans Zimmer, who can't stop using every instrument that exists. And is based on, here's the real kicker, Loyola, Maryland alum and journalist Mark Bowden's 1999 book of the same name. So we have two neoconservative, controversial writers that write too many war novels. It follows the U.S. military's 1993 raid in Mogadishu, Somalia, during the Somali Civil War, whose mission, the mission of the U.S. military, in hindsight, it goes unsurprisingly horribly wrong, and they have to attempt to capture Mohammed Farah Aidid, a militia leader proclaiming himself president and starving his people of the UN food shipments. And a Black Hawk, or possibly two, you'll have to watch the movie to find out if there's one or two that go down. It has an all-star cast, including prequel Obi-Wan, Michael Fitzgerald from the television crime drama series Cracker, and Tom Sizemore, R.I.P., and William Fichtner, how you pronounce his name, from a lot of stuff, and Lucius Malfoy and Will Graham from Hannibal, and Legolas / Will Turner and Phil Dunphy from Modern Family,
We're
and
going to be
Jamie
here a
Lannister
long
from Game of
time if you
Thrones,
list all of them.
and Tom Hardy from everything. So what did you guys think about this movie?
Well, we kind of addressed it at the end there of your comments, but I was impressed by how huge this cast is. Not just in terms of, there's so many characters, but in terms of how many genuine celebrities are in this movie. And I understand that some of them became bigger deals after this movie came out, but still, there's a lot of names on this cast list. And if you were to try to make this nowadays, it probably would be like the most expensive movie ever made. In terms of the film itself, I think it really works as, and I kind of addressed this in my Letterboxd review, I think it works very well as just sort of a straight war action film. But it does, and not to delve too deep into the politics here, but it does feel a little irresponsible in how simplistically it seems to view this conflict that actually happened. I wrote in my notes that this basically sort of just feels like, what if Ridley Scott had directed Aliens instead of Jim Cameron? I mean, obviously, it's not exactly the same thing, but it very much treats the Somalian people, whether they be militants, terrorists, or civilians, they're just sort of like creatures who pop up and go, ah, and occasionally kill a member of the Marines and then pop back down again, which is a little troubling and maybe, not even maybe, a little insensitive. But I do think, just in terms of a film, not addressing the politics head on, if we kind of ignore that dimension, Ridley Scott does an amazing job handling a really heavy workload here. Like we mentioned, there's like 40 different main characters. There's a million different plot lines, because even though it's mainly just about the raid that goes wrong. There's so many different angles of like, well, these 3 people are here and this is what's happening to them, and this guy's over here and this is what is happening to them, and everybody is kind of similarly costumed, and every bit of the city kind of looks similar. It's not like someone's in the jungle and someone is in the desert. So the fact that Ridley Scott was able to keep track of all of these elements in a way that allows us to go, oh, it's them now, and we can constantly keep up with the narrative is really kind of miraculous. I gave it a 3 out of 5. I do think it's pretty dated. It starts to drag toward the end, and I think there are some problematic elements, but just as like a feat of direction, I think it's, and editing. It did win Best Editing, I think, at the Academy Awards, which I think is well deserved. I'm very impressed in those dimensions.
Yeah, fair enough. I watched this less than 24 hours ago, and I already feel like I can't remember like a single specific scene. It all just kind of blurs together for me, for better or for worse, aside from like the first 30 or 40 minutes before the operation actually begins. I landed on a 3.5 out of 5 for most of the same reasons Zach gave. I think filmically it's impressive, though it doesn't feel a lot like a Ridley Scott film to me because, and I mentioned this in my written review, aesthetically it is really dated in a way that some older films aren't. It's so thoroughly confined to the early 2000s, and there's this like, I don't know if I'd call it like, it's not as saturated as like a Michael Bay film, but there's just this like grimy but also like neon like sheen over everything.
It's pretty deep fried, yeah.
Yes, that's a good way of putting it.
Deep fried filter.
And I don't know, maybe I've just seen so many war films to the point where that's a point of criticism, even if that sets it apart from the others. I'm not sure. I think the cast is obviously great. The director is obviously great. I take issue with Hans Zimmer's score, and I swear it's not just because it's him. I really like, and I have a bad track record with Zimmer, but I'll just set the record straight. Like the innovations he did for Dune were remarkable. What he did on some other films like Pirates is obviously iconic, but at some point when you just look at the sheer body of work the man has over the past couple decades, I mean, you're going to mail it in, and you're going to lean on your team of other composers. And in this case, it's not that his music was ineffectual or it didn't work in the context of a scene, but rather that it was like it felt like 2 strokes away from the parody of like every non-Western country setting music where there's like the choir.
Oh yeah.
and that happened like at least a couple dozen times, and I was just kind of like, oh geez, well, sure, minor chords give this tension, I guess. But I don't know, musically, meh. Obviously the action is great. I don't think I take as much issue with the politics as you do, Zach, and maybe for me that's because
that's hardly surprising. But.
No. Come on, we can discuss this.
Sure, yeah.
I think, by design, it's obviously an American perspective of the place and the conflict, and it's a legitimate problem for those forces to distinguish between civilians and potential threats. So to me, it kind of makes sense that there wouldn't be a clear demarcation between those two things. And I did at least appreciate the nonfiction elements of this, where they're detailing the rules of engagement. And it's true that the UN has, if they send in like peacekeepers, they're not allowed to intervene unless they're attacked. And like I don't want to be all like poli-sci major here, but I did take a course this past spring on civil wars in failed states. So that element of it was legitimately interesting to me, and I thought reasonably and almost impressively accurate for a Hollywood film. So I wanted to at least put that out there.
Yeah. I never actually wrote my review, but I will say I gave this a 3.5 out of 5 as well.
Oh, okay.
And yeah, I'm not as gung-ho about it, Zach. I heard that okay in that tone. I like poking fun at Zach whenever there's a war film being discussed.
Yes.
So Zach is immediately the enemy.
So do many.
Yeah. Yeah. I was. Oh, damn. You know. That's 2 high schools in a row. I really enjoy the action elements of this film. I think I agree with Zach in that it's basically it functions the best as an action film. I think really the politics is I would say it's irresponsible, but at the same time it comes out at like such a really weird time. Like this is like the timing of this is very almost disturbing at how like inconvenient it is, I guess, considering how America generally feels about political action in the Middle East and in Africa after this came out. And I think at the time, I definitely think it would have been more acceptable, and I think the significance of this battle being that 18 soldiers died, and that was the most like single amount of loss for American soldiers since Vietnam. I think that's pretty significant. And then Clinton helped kind of push the narrative that this was like Somali syndrome, where having like that this is kind of representative of what might happen if we keep kind of doing these sorts of operations. And it's like the worst irony ever because we had this was likely, I mean, I guess there is anecdotal evidence I can cite where this was used as propaganda for forwarding action in Iraq and Afghanistan and things like that too. But that's what I think it's so interesting. I feel like it kind of speaks on its own, and I definitely don't think I think it's definitely a subjective American account, but I think it does the most damage in what it doesn't talk about, but it only gets worse in hindsight. So it definitely doesn't age. I think that's probably the worst part about it, is that it doesn't age very well. But considering the context and considering what the film was going for at that time, and considering even though it may be irresponsible to consider that one isolated battle as an issue and not just addressing the obvious issues of misportraying the Somalis and the political implication of showing each individual American as a hero. I think the top review of Letterboxd, when it said this was pro-military but anti-war, is somewhat accurate. I do think there are pro-war elements in this, but I think the overall messaging is definitely anti-war, and I definitely think it's as pro-military as you can get before being just straight propaganda. Mm-hmm. And I feel like that makes this a very unique film in a good way, and I enjoy the action elements because of that. But yeah, at the same time, it's really hard not to overlook the political aspects of it, and I do fault the film for that partially, and I do think that there's a lot of issue that can be taken, especially from a modern perspective, when you're looking at how badly this sort of military intervention kind of standard that was set, how badly that turned out. Mm-hmm. Even today is still an issue. And I think that's like mostly agreed upon by the American public. So as I speak on behalf of everyone, coming from a very clearly biased perspective also. But at the same time, 3.5 out of 5. So yeah, you kind of discussed this. I think both of you mentioned it, Ridley Scott's direction, about how this doesn't really feel much of a Ridley Scott movie. Do you feel like that there's any influence, like what are the main influences out of the course of his career that kind of led him to make this film, and then how does his style come across to you, and like how does that come across to you? I guess let's leave it at that.
Yeah, so there's a couple of different Ridley Scotts throughout his career, because the man has flip-flopped a visual style a little bit. I don't think this is totally against his visual grain, but it does belong to like a very narrow little pocket of the kinds of movies that he's made that he hasn't done much of since like the late 90s and early 2000s. Because you've got early Ridley Scott, who made like Blade Runner and Legend, and was often criticized for making like almost over the top beautiful movies where every single shot is like amazingly lit, and so in sort of like the 90s and early 2000s, he starts to move into this almost kind of like frenetic, lots of handhelds. I'm going to make it look like a documentary, but it's still a movie look. Which the only examples I can really cite right now or think of off the top of my dome are this and G.I. Jane. And then after that, he sort of moves in like a more digital version of what he did in the 70s and 80s. Yes, House of Gucci is an immaculately beautiful movie.
Why do we keep bringing up House of Gucci?
Because when I said that, I thought, oh, but House of Gucci. I do think, and it's so weird to think that this was pre 9/11, even though it came out on a wide release after 9/11. Because if this was post 9/11, then I would say that this was influenced by like news coverage of the conflict and him wanting to sort of immerse the audience and the public in this feeling of combat. And that might even be the case, but that sort of thing wasn't as commonplace and as much of a national concern like while this movie was being produced, I think, than it would be a couple months later. So I think the convenience of when it came out kind of clouds any hypotheticals on what his intention might have been. I do think the shots are there, and it's edited like it is in this really frenetic way to make it feel like you're there in the conflict and you're actually in this situation where there's smoke everywhere and everybody's in uniform and you can't quite tell who's who and the sun is gleaming right in your eyes and somebody blew up over there. Was that Orlando Bloom? I don't know, and we have to just kind of keep moving. I am going to say, I think it was... I said earlier that it wasn't that difficult to keep track of everybody. I do think there's a lot of cases in this film where it is, but I think that's intentional. Where once the bullets are flying out there and everybody's in uniform and people are getting shot down and trucks are getting blown up, it's difficult to tell, like, who are your buddies and who's just another person. So it took me like 45 minutes to realize that it was Orlando Bloom that fell out of the helicopter. Like an hour in, I was like, we haven't seen Orlando Bloom in a while. Did he die? Is he the guy who got a rocket-propelled grenade stuck in his side? And then, oh, he fell out of the helicopter. Wow. And it does give you that whiplash, which isn't a thing you see in a ton of Ridley Scott, but I do feel that's the point, is sort of the stylistic whiplash and you as a viewer getting that feeling of, oh, what is going on, as you're kind of in the setting.
Sure. And I definitely lost track of them throughout the movie too. I think its textual purpose kind of boils down to two interactions. One being, I think they both involved Eric Bana, but I'm not certain if he was in the first one or if the other guy was the same guy both times or which guy either time it was.
That guy.
But somebody's like asking him like, oh, do you think we should be here? Or something like that. And he's like, I don't care. It's not my job to think about that stuff. And then towards the end, they're having like a similar conversation. And he's like, I think maybe the other guy's asking him why they're doing it, or he's asking them, do you think anyone back home will understand why we do it, or something? And he says something along the lines of, they'll never understand, but it's as simple as, I'm here for the man next to me. And which is a powerful notion that might have landed harder for me if I didn't feel like most of the war films we've watched at this point have some version of this scene in them. You know? So, but at the same time, I think it's totally fine for a movie like this for that to be the thesis. Is it limiting or unoriginal? Perhaps, but I don't think it's inherently immoral. Maybe it's problematic. I can see why people would take it one way or the other, but I don't know. For better or for worse, I think that's where Ridley was coming from with all of it.
Yeah, and I think that kind of also comes down to like the pro-military but anti-war angle. Because I compare this to a movie like Apocalypse Now, where I think the message of Apocalypse Now is war is hell and the military is the organization that puts people in that situation. That scene with like the bridge in Apocalypse Now. Every day they blow it up and the military sends us back out here to put it together again so they can blow it up that night. I think this film is more war is hell, and like the men in suits are the ones who send the military into that situation. So it's kind of a flipping of perspectives. But yeah, I think that's that interaction is a good point. But I kind of forgotten about that. By the time you get to that interaction, along with the characters, you're like so exhausted that you're like, oh,
yeah.
Is he gonna take a nap first?
Yeah.
The operation was supposed to last 3 weeks, but it's been lasting 6, and Washington is very mad at them. Bill Clinton will be calling their parents. Your son needs to do a better job. What is going on here? Yeah, I agree with, like, going back to the directing thing. I can't really tell too much about the Ridley Scott stuff. It feels like honestly, the whole, if you think of The Last Patrol, which was the 9th episode of Band of Brothers, when they have to cross the river and they're at Haguenau, the town of Alsace, and they're trying to cross the river and everything. It's nighttime and they have to take off their helmets and everything. And there's a lot of characters that are introduced that we don't really know about, but we just sympathize with them because of the operation and like what the situation that's happening within the operation. And really, however much context you add, I feel like the way Scott did it with the bookending it, basically, like having the politics be mostly towards the beginning and towards the end, was effective. And I think it's effective because he wants the audience to be brought to the individual soldier perspective and the soldier experience. And as time goes on, as more context is added, especially because this is still technically like an active place for the U.S. military now in a lot of ways. It's not not nearly as actionable as it was then, but Somalia is definitely still a major concern.
Watch Captain Phillips next if you
dare. Politically. And I think it's so difficult for today's standards to be like, well, how could you not think of the politics of it? Like, how could you not add context to this? Because this is such a bad standard that we ended up setting. And this is a bad way to represent the Somalis, et cetera, et cetera. But I think this is really important to separate like the director's vision and like Zach, you said, like we're not entirely sure because of how much like history's clouded this and how many different reviews have been put out by critics for different perspectives. And I mean, reading Roger Ebert's review, it's like from a complete time capsule. Reading the 2002 review of it, like saying, "Wow, this is real American power here. We really sympathize with them and everything." It's like, well, I'm not going to go that far as saying we're not sympathizing with the American military necessarily. We're sympathizing with the soldiers that are on the ground, that are suffering under it. And additionally, I can especially considering my position now, I can definitely see the frustration from the command perspective, and I'm like, wow, this is like a logical decision that they're making. This is like a really big concern. Why would they want to have another bird be taken down just for these guys? I mean, this is like a logical leader's decision. And I think part of that uniqueness that Zach had mentioned, like having the people in the suits and the Washington being the issue versus the generals being the issue, was a very popular sentiment of the time and continued to be a popular sentiment, for better or for worse. But I think that it worked here, having those minor jabs at the administration versus jabbing at the actual concept of the military and how it's the military that's actually the issue here. I think in this specific instance, I feel comfortable sympathizing with the soldiers, and I feel comfortable sympathizing with their situation, and I feel like that's where the film really shines. I feel like any other context that you look at it from, like especially from a modern like average perspective, if you were just walking in, you'd be like, wow, this is like really pro-war, this is like so awful, why do we have to look at it from this way? But I won't have a controversy question later about this, because we've talked about it a lot, but it's very hard not to address because, you know, this is a film that's very shrouded in controversy, and it's not the same controversy as like, well, it's in the Iraq War, so it's like obviously bad, but or Vietnam or something. This is like a very cloudy area, and I feel like it's very ripe for discussion in that way. But do you think that having the action scenes obviously closely reminded by Saving Private Ryan and Band of Brothers, and having that forwarding that way of filming action where it's very low frames and frantic, and still being able to keep track of people, and just having that constant chugging of the machine of people randomly coming out of nowhere. Do you feel like the action sequences are suitable for this sort of film?
Yeah, I think it works for this genre. You mentioned Saving Private Ryan, and Saving Private Ryan, when it came out, I forget what year that was.
98, 99?
That sounds right. But Saving Private Ryan, I mean, it won a ton of Academy Awards. It changed everything for war movies, and specifically for filming scenes of combat. Where early 2000s, this whole, like, we're going to drop the frames and there's going to be a million edits, and you're going to turn to your partner and see a pile of goo that used to be his face. And so I do think that works. Is it a little exhausting? Yes, especially since basically the entire movie is that. And I get that that's the point. I think I prefer war movies that are filmed a little in a bit more of a stylish manner. Things are a little more reserved. There's like dollies instead of it all being handheld. But I think if you're arguing for realism, and you're arguing for, well, what's appropriate and what makes this feel like a real conflict rather than a movie I saw about a real conflict, I think this is the technique that does it. Because I think the more style that you introduce to a war film, specifically a war film about an actual conflict and actual people that actually died, the more style and flair you introduce to that, the more you sort of subconsciously fictionalize it. And I do think that's something you want to avoid for this kind of thing.
Yeah. I don't know if I can really nitpick the style that much, just because, well, it's like however, from whatever perspective you look at, like, another person's dialect or accent, to them, the way you speak is a dialect or accent. It's like there's no true neutral. And in that sense, I think it works. And I think it shares most of the charms and shortcomings of Saving Private Ryan in that way. The extreme nature of the action and the somewhat one-dimensional purpose of the plot and whatever it is they're trying to say. Yeah, I don't have anything else to add, but I think it works fine.
Yeah, I definitely agree with the frantic the frantic way of filming with the handheld, and I totally agree. It gets exhausting, and definitely it starts to get like, you're like, oh, can't they just get out? It goes from like oh, there's so many dying, why do they have to keep dying to save them? It gets to the point where it's like, oh, they keep filming with handheld, and there's so many bullets flying everywhere, and I need this to end. It definitely becomes that way, and I understand that's the point as well. But it's hard for me to like argue. I guess what I was thinking, it's hard for me to argue like how much of it could actually be taken out. I mean, because it still works in a linear fashion, and it works to convey that same, I guess, 1-to-1 time ratio where you feel like you're progressing as much as they are. And I feel like that definitely works, and I think you totally feel that entire 100% grittiness. You feel like every single piece of dirt and blood splatter and organ and limb loss throughout this whole thing. And I think that is like that totally works effectively. And at the same time, I think it works because it works a lot better than trying to work away from, I guess, what the book could be saying. I guess because the more time you're showing generals and politicians, possibly, I'm just like hypothetical, like showing leaders talk about what's happening and then showing what's happening, I feel like the more you're showing when the leaders are talking, you're relying more on that the wider scale like context I was talking about that could become problematic. Like, what is their actual intent in Somalia? What is their actual intent with this mission? Do they actually care about everyone there? But I feel like that straight army, like one thing after another, like we just got to continue with the mission. This is what we're supposed to do, get our guys out, and then just action. I feel like that is a really great format for this very specific battle at this time, because if it had been filmed without a lot of that context, let's say like for World War II, if it was like just the action, or it was just like the Normandy landing from Saving Private Ryan 5 times in a row in different places, then I feel like we'd be very tired and very concerned, like, okay, what is the actual goal here? Why are we seeing them all die? And then having that questioning. And I feel like as a war film in that right, it does a really good job. And then, so for the casting, I know we talked about, it's obviously an ensemble cast, like none ever seen. I think it's probably like the biggest ensemble cast I've ever seen for a war film, probably ever in American history. Do you think it actually does justice here? Because a lot of the actors are in their early stages, if not literally their beginning stages. Because Tom Hardy, this is his first movie role, and his first actual role was in Band of Brothers during that one funny scene. So, what do you guys think about the casting here? Was it worth it?
Well, Tom Hardy's awesome, and
I mean, like when he deafens Spud. That's fun.
All you have to do is watch any of that guy's interviews, and you just know he's game for pretty much anything, and not really intimidated by being new to Hollywood or something like some others might understandably be. So he was great. I thought it was a predictable reminder of how limiting Orlando Bloom is, and I don't dislike him, but I mean, I rewatched the Lord of the Rings films like last winter break or summer, recently enough to have impressions still, and I mean, he's like the weakest part of the Fellowship there, and he's fine in Pirates, but it was just another reminder that, okay, maybe he's not so far above the how did we describe it in Pearl Harbor? The handsome man and pretty woman or whatever.
Oh, yeah.
But and Ewan McGregor was fine. I don't know. I think they all do what they're asked, and I think if any of them stood out as movie star in a specific way, it would subtract from the ensemble purpose of the whole thing and the way that we lose track of individuals by design. So, and shout out, one name you didn't identify is I have no idea how to pronounce his first name, but the guy that plays Mr. Fantastic.
Oh, Yoan Grufford?
Yeah. Yes, my guy.
Has a seizure and then leaves the movie after one scene.
The only lieutenant in this entire movie.
Yeah, I kind of agree with that. Even though a lot of the big stars in this movie maybe weren't big stars at the time, I think the way that this movie uses everybody, everyone is so equally shrouded in dust and grime that nobody really feels like the movie star. Even though Josh Hartnett is on the poster, I wouldn't watch this movie and go, yeah, it's a movie about Josh Hartnett, and he goes into nobody really feels like the lead, to the extent that, like, I don't know if you guys realize, we have a few Cookie Pocket alum in this film, but the one I want to point out is the villain from Kindergarten Cop is in this movie.
Yes. What? Yes, I recognized him.
He's one of the first guys. He finds the first helicopter, I think, and he's like dual wielding machine guns and gets shot like 3 times in the chest, and I think that's the last time we see him.
Yeah.
He's the one who kind of looks like Val Kilmer.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, but even he is like on the level, like he gets as much screen time as some of the major stars in this film. The only one who feels underused to me, or improperly used, is Sam Shepard, who plays I guess he'd be the general. I'm not totally up to date on military rank, but Sam Shepard is like a legendary playwright and actor. I think the only time we've discussed him is that he plays Ryan Gosling's dad in The Notebook, which, Christian, you mentioned on Week in Review once, like 2 seasons ago. But he's an amazing actor, and like he has a huge resume, and he spends like the entirety of this movie just chewing on a cigar, looking at screens, and doesn't really do much. And he has like maybe 1 or 2 scenes where you get to see something behind his eyes, but for the most part, it just sort of feels like, why did you need Sam Shepard for this role? Why did you get arguably the biggest legend in this movie and just have him like looking at CRT televisions for the entire thing?
Yeah, I think I totally agree, and plus, let's be honest, like, the roles are not really that terribly demanding. I mean, they all had some experience at Benning, like with Ranger stuff for like a week, I think. So they had some exposure to that, but they're not characters that are necessarily meant to be developed over time. They're kind of just supposed to leave an impression. And I feel like leaving an impression based on their dialogue amidst action in their own right, I feel like they can achieve that to enough of an extent where we can remember who we're like, oh, that guy who did that thing, who said that thing, you know? And I feel like that's so interesting that we can attach these characters and feel bad for them just on these like very incidental things that they've said or done. And that's a lot of times in real combat, that's literally how it works. I mean, there's people they remember just by like this one private or something, and like I don't even remember his name, but like I saw him, like, you know, I was just talking to him 2 seconds ago and he's 18 and he just got shot or he fell out of a helicopter or something, and it was like that was it, you know. And it's just like it's interesting how that incidental development of the characters and seeing them die, it makes us feel just bad enough for them where that you want to see them succeed. And a lot of that is used in other action films, and we were just talking about Saving Private Ryan. It's kind of a similar thing, except we do get that character development because they're on a very specific mission, and you know they go through all this other stuff besides just getting shot at every 5 seconds. But I think it makes it enjoyable, and I also think it helps. It puts less strain on the actors, and it makes it a lot less important, I feel like, to have very specific acting potential. I do think that Sam Shepard's a standout. And I also think, what was I just thinking of? Oh yeah, Sizemore. Sizemore is the biggest standout for the soldiers on the ground, because he actually does have somewhat of a character arc, and you can definitely see how the battles impress on him, and how he instantly goes from being like, we can totally do this, to being like, we can't do this anymore, we have too many wounded, let's just get the hell out of here kind of perspective. And it's a very traditional, like, well-trodden way of doing a war film when it comes to that. Like, the soldiers are ready to go, and then they get very demoralized very quickly. But understanding the situation that they're in and how unique it is, I feel like that is what makes it very engaging. At the same time, it does get worn down a lot over time, though. Keeping that same thing, eventually you're like, okay, this is just ridiculous now. I mean, how many these Somalis have jobs? Come on now, they have some other things to be doing. Apparently they don't have anything going on. According to this movie, they are just absolute savages, just shooting American soldiers at the wazoo.
I will point out, though, I think the costume designer for this film does a really great job of bringing like little touches of humanity to the Somalian characters or Somali characters, because the script doesn't really give them much at all. But early on, there's like a 12-year-old kid who's he's like signaling that the helicopters are flying off the base, and he's wearing a Bee Gees shirt.
Yeah, I saw that.
And I think that's just like that's a great individual touch of just like, maybe that's just the only shirt he could find, and he's never heard the Bee Gees in his life. Or maybe he's heard the Bee Gees like once and thought they were this cool band. But it gets you thinking about that character, and thinking about that character as a person in a way that I think a lot of the writing of those characters doesn't really.
Yeah, and I think Christian definitely mentioned this also. Just coming from the American perspective, it's super, super difficult to go out of your way to humanize the enemy when you have so many like pages and pages and so many, like hundreds of accounts of this awful things that the enemy is doing to you, and all they are is the enemy, and it's so hard to like portray that into a film. I think my dad was just telling me about Letters from Iwo Jima and how that was a great supplement. And I think
that's a really good movie.
Yeah, and I think it's especially coming into this time now where the enemy's more difficult to point out, and like rules of engagement are literally changing like every month, and there's different, you know, there's every country has different ways of doing things and different cultures, and it's so I mean, this film would be like double the length if it really had to go into depth of actually explaining why the Somalis are the way that they are, and why they're being a part of this militia. Are some of them just crazy, or some of them, like, you know, are they politically motivated, or are they motivated because they have no other option? Like, sadly, we have to say that it doesn't matter for the sake of the messaging of the movie, but at the same time, it's like it's hard to overlook it. And I've read a lot of critic reviews, especially in the past like 10 years or so, where there's been a lot of criticism of the way the Somalis were portrayed and everything. But it's an ongoing issue when it comes to any war film, any American war film portraying any American action in the Middle East or Africa at all, because it's going to be the same type of thing, and you're always going to end up touching controversy in one way or another. But I appreciate that mention of there are some humanizing parts, and it's not entirely void of any Somali humanity, because we had multiple like conversations with the actual Somalis, even though they're actually not Somali actors. Apparently there wasn't a single Somali actor this entire thing, which is kind of weird. But regardless of that, I think it for, as Zach had mentioned, void of politics, I think that this is, you know, an appropriate way of portraying a very subjective account of an objective operation. And that's pretty much all I have to say about that. So before I get canceled. So if there's any other final thoughts.
Not really final thoughts on the movie as a whole, but there's a very specific bit in the score that sounds, at least to me, almost identical to the drum line of the Wonder Woman theme from the modern DC movies. The sort of dung 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 dung. The guitar doesn't show up.
Yeah.
But I was like, what does this remind me of? And it's kind of towards the end as the helicopters are landing to pick everybody up. And I think that other than sort of the throat singing, which is a bit of a Hollywood, which I wasn't gonna do, and is a bit of a Hollywood cliche for like foreign countries. That's really the only bit of the score that like stood out to me, because I was like, wait a minute, where do I know this?
Yeah, I will say that the only part of the score I'd say is really good is the guitar riffs mixed with the chants when they're going in, like the very low chugging when the helicopters are coming in. So it's kind of like the American introduction to the foreign environment, and I think that's pretty cool, and it's very subtle, and also the very subtle drums in the background when they're actually fighting. It's kind of like a low intensity versus a high intensity. So I feel like the high pitches of the bullets and yelling, it works well with like the lower intensity percussion, and that's the extent of my music theory knowledge. So Christian, go ahead.
Oh, I have no final thoughts. It's a 3.5 out of 5, and I think I don't know. I think it's pretty predictable whether you would enjoy this one or not. So
yeah, I
take
totally
what you
agree.
will from that. Yeah.
All right. Shall we can review it? Get Christian to his cinema screening.
Let's do it.
Okay, I haven't talked about music on here in a while, and I feel like making people angry.
Oh no.
I just came off of listening to all of Neil Young, which was difficult because that man took all his music off of Spotify, so I had to hunt down individual tracks on YouTube. But that's not who I'm talking about, because today I moved on to Tom Waits. And I listened to his debut album. And I mentioned in my brief Twitter thoughts, I have never really listened to Tom Waits, even though people have told me I would like him. And from what I've heard, I've mostly heard his newer stuff, where he sounds like a goblin with a throat made of rocks. But going back to like his first album, before he had smoked a million cigarettes, he's not a fantastic singer, but he really embodies this sort of like down and out like bar piano player, and it's really the vibe he's going for. Even amongst like Tom Waits fans, it's acknowledged that his first like 3 or 4 albums are very, very different, and mostly sort of like Los Angeles like dive bar crooner blues stuff. But there's also some peppy stuff in there too. There's a song called Ice Cream Man, which is so danceable and so fun. It's insane. I really did not expect that song from an album that before that had basically entirely just been saxophone and piano. So yeah, this was a real surprise, because I think the only Tom Waits song I'd heard before this was Don't Go Into That Barn, which if anybody who listens to this knows Tom Waits, they'll know that's the most Tom Waits song that has ever been sung by Tom Waits, where he's like screaming the entire thing through a megaphone, and there's like a tractor backfiring in the background for the beat. And this was not that at all. So Tom Waits, Closing Time, I would recommend it. A 3 out of 5. It's a solid album, and I'm pretty excited to listen to the rest of his work.
Well, okay. Okay. Now I have to decide what I'm talking about.
Come on, we got to get you to the movies.
Yeah. I'm jumping back further than a week again, because who's going to stop me? Nobody's going to stop me.
The law.
Yes. I watched, season 2, not really a season, but I guess part 2 of Star Wars Visions, which are a series of short films. The first season or collection or whatever you'd call it were by a host of anime studios from Japan. And this season they broadened it to animation studios from around the world, including France, India, the UK, others that are currently slipping my mind, a few in Africa. You get the idea. And generally these are very loosely connected to Star Wars. None of them are considered like official canon, and they all try to deal with a small part of the universe in like 15 minutes or so. I think only one of them in either collection is over 20 minutes long, so they are quite short. And season 2 was definitely a step down, and at some point I think it's a diminishing returns thing, where you quickly realize that when these studios are faced with what part of Star Wars they want to interrogate in 15 minutes, many of them land squarely on the Force, or a child who is Force sensitive and is tempted by the dark side, but they're on the run, so they're hiding, or it's that, but it's they're a rebel, but they no, don't tell. and so alas, etc. There was one, they got Aardman Studios to do one called I Am Your Mother, which was, I was excited for. I was hoping it would be like bizarre and anachronistic, and instead it was just kind of a shrug. Very, very fluffy, like 12-minute fun thing that was forgettable. The standout in this collection was Screecher's Reach for me. I'm not sure what the name of the studio is, but it's just 15 minutes long, and it does fit the mold of a young girl tempted by the dark side, but it's hard to summarize it without giving it away, but it gets to more dramatic consequence than most of these do. Ultimately, if you're a Star Wars fan, if you're interested in giving atypical types of animation that you don't always see coming out of American studios a try, I would certainly give it a go. It's not going to take much of your time. Much of this looks beautiful, if that's more of your concern. I tend to be more of a writing guy myself, but I think my average for this season was probably a 3 or a 3.5, and I didn't give any of them under a 3, but I would also say that none of them were particularly memorable.
Well, if you like Army Rangers doing bad things in foreign countries, I got another film for you. And it's not Black Hawk Down. It's a slightly more straightforward movie, The Great Raid, which 2005, which came out after, which is interesting because, it's interesting. Yeah. So it's about the 6 Rangers in the Pacific during World War II, and they are trying to save POWs. So another POW movie. And it's based on a real story, which is actually, insanely, you would never believe it would have happened. Actually. I'm not just saying that as an advertisement. But I think that the story itself of having all these, having this ROTC commissionee guy who doesn't know anything from anything. All he knows is how to sit in the woods and cry about not being in his college courses because it's too freaking early in the morning to be doing Army stuff. So he comes from this experience, and he's directly drafted, and he's only been in an officer. He's captain, and it's James Franco, and he's only been in for however long, 6 years maybe, probably not even that long. And he has to lead this operation of liberate 500 Americans, using just a Ranger battalion, which is, and there's like almost like over 1,000 Japanese they have to go through, and it's very cool. It's a really cool, like the action scenes are filmed great, and it's a great story. You have no reason to really care for the characters other than the fact that they're POWs. There's a kind of a side quest thing that goes on with one of the prisoners' wives who's smuggling in malaria pills, and she kind of befriends some of the other the Filipinos that are in the hospital that she works in, and that's like just a random other story. And she's probably one of the most intriguing characters actually, but. I don't really remember, like, besides 3 or 4 characters, I don't really remember anybody else. I mean, it's a very lackluster in character development sort of film, and I don't think I think it doesn't really do the story justice, and the planning's interesting to watch, and the actual action's fun to watch, but otherwise the rest of the film is very chock full of, like, artificial drama and Hollywood kind of pepping up, like, oh, they're almost there, they're 10 miles away, they're 5 miles away, they're 3 miles away, and you know that they're going to end up getting liberated, so it's kind of like, you know, it becomes very bog standard, like 2/3 of the way in. I think you're just kind of waiting for them to win. There's some very incidental good scenes, and I don't think the James Franco narration works very well, and I think he's just not, he's not really good for this sort of role, and I just, you know, I don't want to criticize him too much, but you know, I think he was a lot better in the interview. So, and like a lot of the no-name actors. I mean, there's the friend of Jude Law from Enemy at the Gates. If you guys remember that guy, who kind of sacrifices himself.
Yeah,
spoiler. Yeah. He was pretty good. He was the one that was infected with malaria with the wife, and there's some engaging dialogue with the Kempetai who eventually come to the camp, the Japanese secret police, but it's just like. It's a POW movie. There's not a lot of crazy, like, torture or anything. I mean, it's plays it very safe, and you know, it was very fun to watch. Like, the story is very interesting. The way it transfers from black and white into color, and then back to black and white towards the end, is very engaging. And there's a lot of real footage that they use at the beginning and end that really solidifies the fact that this was a real event. And it's very obvious what's dramatized and what isn't. So, the story's great, but in terms of like a film, it was very meh. So I gave it 3 stars, but it's a fun little adventure in the Philippines. On to our next segment.
Sure. Marvelous Cinema Tour.
Yay.
I can keep this brief. I watched Shang-Chi this past week. Now, what I will say, first act, martial arts weren't that bad. There were some nice wide shots that really displayed the stunts and the martial arts well. There's even some like intention, some like attempt to work in sort of like slapstick into the fight scenes. I think there's a moment on the bus fight where Simu Liu lands next to like a random woman on the bus, and there's just kind of a beat where he turns to her and he like gives a goofy smile, and then he gets up and he's immediately back into the fight. That feels very Jackie Chan. Unfortunately, Simu Liu is not Jackie Chan. And
so
pretty much once they get to, I forget where the Fight Club is. The Fight Club in, I think, Hong Kong or Shanghai. Once they get there, it just becomes much less interesting throughout the whole second half, as there is more CGI, and it just keeps tunneling into the lore, which I find to be the least interesting aspect of these films at this point. Also, there's a ninja character who is built up as some kind of like a big bad that Shang-Chi is going to have to fight at some point, and that never happens. The ninja just gets his soul sucked out, like, before the climax even really begins, in a major anticlimax. If that was played right, it could feel clever and kind of funny, but it is not. Also, Ben Kingsley is totally wasted, and retroactively, his whole like part in Iron Man 3 is sort of ruined by this movie sort of kowtowing to disappointed fans from that film. Yeah, this came to a 2 out of 5. It's certainly better than Black Widow, and I'm not going to call it I'm not going to call it the worst one that I've seen so far by any means. It's just kind of in the bottom half. Next one up is Eternals, which I think will just be
Even
long
I haven't seen that one, Zach.
and boring.
Wow.
So yeah, tune in next time if you want to hear what I have to say about that one. Time to run down.
We may run down. Let's
Okay.
run. Speed run down. Minute for Christian. Christian goes because he's the target.
Okay.
He is the target, and we have all the age 6 little birds and freaking UH-60 Blackhawks, and we gotta get him. He's starving his people for America.
All right.
Okay.
Are you gonna time this one, Mitchell?
You can time it, Zach.
Oh God. Okay.
Yep.
All right.
I have to delegate responsibilities.
You gonna start?
I will start.
Okay. In 3, 2, 1, start.
America Restoring Order.
4 out of 5.
Low FPS action sequences.
3 out of 5.
Miami is not Cuban.
3 out of 5.
Aviator grammar debate.
3 out of 5.
Orlando Bloom looks 12.
2 out of 5.
Strolling on a live range.
3 out of 5.
Making fun of goober officers.
4 out of 5.
Josh Hartnett is canceled.
5 out of 5.
Steve Martin induced seizures.
4 out of 5.
No one getting in or out.
4 out of 5.
Be all you can be.
3 out of 5.
Sorry ass JROTC.
3 out of 5.
Only shooting when being shot at.
2 out of 5.
Movie title being said.
3 out of 5.
What?
3 out of 5.
Nice donkey.
4 out of 5.
Keeping your foot on the gas.
4 out of 5.
Americans not smoking anymore.
4 out of 5.
Killing being negotiation.
3 out of 5.
Hand signals.
2 out of 5.
Civilians in the absolute worst
Whoop.
places.
Time.
Can't answer that one.
I can't.
Keep your mouth shut.
All right.
Okay.
We're tight on time, so I'm going to preview what we're talking about next time. Next episode I will be hosting, and we'll be talking about Alan Parker's Angel Heart. This is a film that's kind of slipped under the radar, but it's by a great director of Birdie, which we all liked when we talked about it last season in Week in Review.
You had my curiosity.
And it's got some real stars, including Robert De Niro in kind of an underrated performance. So tune in next time if you want to hear us talk about Angel Heart.
All right. This has been Cookie Pocket. I'll see you in another foreign country to spread America's democracy another day.
There will be
Roger
throat
Track
singing.
There will be throat. Ah!
Oh, no.
All right. Bye, folks.